Often when I read the Bible, I'd be quite pleased if I could have a video of the events and not just read the words from the Bible in the book, as of course I do all the time. The advantage of a video would be you'd actually be able to see what Jesus was doing. It's particularly important in this great story we're going to look at today about Jesus writing with his finger in the dust. Theologians have speculated for years on what on earth he drew in the dust. I've got no idea, of course, but a video snapshot of it would show you what he drew and why it was so important. Was he just doodling in the dust, waiting for the penny to drop in the minds of the accusers of this woman caught in adultery, or was he quoting an Old Testament verse, a reference of some kind, or a picture? We really don't know. So I'm not going to show you a video. I've got to read you the passage, and we'll think about what's going on here in the mind of Jesus, in the minds of the accusers, in the mind of the woman, and what Jesus is trying to help us with. And then we'll reflect, of course, on that in the light of the current lockdown situation which we find ourselves in the UK, and indeed in the Western world generally, because we know that, frankly, we're in a terrible mess, and that infection rates are rising around Europe and in America, and frankly no one really knows what to do about it. Lockdown, don't lock down, test and track and trace, and oh goodness, to be honest, there's just complete confusion about the right way forward. And so we'll just reflect a little bit about that as usual. But here's the story, and it's in John's Gospel, and it's in chapter 8. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. So here's Jesus in rabbinic teacher mode, instructing the disciples and anyone else who will listen about the kingdom of God and about the values which obviously Jesus came to embody and to share through his teaching. Verse 3. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" Now, we'll read the rest in just a moment. But here's the thing. Firstly, the writer, John, pretty clear that these teachers of the law and the Pharisees are not entirely open and transparent. They don't care about the woman at all. They're really using her as a chance to trap Jesus. And there's lots of things about that that's just terribly wrong, not least of which is to use this poor woman, quote, caught in adultery, as a mere pawn in their political games, using her in the hope that Jesus will say something that commits himself to heresy in the eyes of the Jews, or even better, insurrection in the eyes of the Romans, so Jesus can be eradicated from the equation and they can get rid of this troublesome rabbi from annoying them anymore. We're not sure actually what the phrase caught in adultery means. Try to remember in the first century world that the bias is all in favour of the man and against the woman. Did she have much choice in this sexual act? Was it actually almost rape from someone else in which she was hardly consensual? It would still be described by the Pharisees as adultery because the man would get off scot-free and she would be blamed. It's very hard to know what's going on here exactly, but we do know that there's an absence of a man to be a protector of this woman. Where's the compassion? Where's the love? Where's the support? Not just from the teachers of the law, but from this woman's family or her husband. That there seems to be no hint of anything going on here other than sheer judgmentalism, condemnation, and an utter disregard for the woman's well-being. And then Jesus wants to take a different approach to this scenario. Jesus doesn't actually say anything to start with. Verse 6 continues, Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his fingers. Middle East, dust everywhere, plenty of scope for writing on the ground. Anyway, when they kept on questioning him, they're not going to let him get away with ignoring them. They sort of bully him, kept on questioning him. The implication is it gets more and more sort of shouty and accusatory. He says, straightening up, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. And it's a shocking statement. He doesn't in any way engage Moses or the law or what the law says and argue about it. But he says, here's something completely different. What the Americans say, from left field comes shooting into the discussion. By the way, any of you who are perfect, you throw the first stone. And then he goes back to his doodling or writing on the floor. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first. Interesting observation that perhaps the older ones, less filled with the vitriol and enthusiasm of youthful judgment, recognizing because of their longer lives that they too have screwed up at various points and feeling a bit guilty by this rabbi who invites them to examine their own consciences, not necessarily in the area of sexual sin like the woman, but just generally. Where are you in obedience to the law you profess to teach and obey? Are you entirely innocent? So, only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up again and said to her, Woman, where are they? Where are the accusers? Where have they gone? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. Jesus answered, Go now and leave your life of sin. Interestingly, I think the implication here is that this may not just be a one-off act of adultery. Perhaps this woman is trapped in some sort of prostitution or even serial marriage. It's very hard to know what's happening. Jesus is very clear with the guilty accusers that are not perfect themselves, and he's very clear with the woman. Notice that Jesus doesn't say the adultery's okay, sexual sin's all right, those judgmental people are all wrong, and you don't worry about it, the way you behaved's fine. There's none of that. Jesus is not authenticating her lifestyle. He doesn't say, yeah, it's really great, adultery, no big deal. He doesn't say that, there's not a hint of that. So Jesus is quite clear throughout his teaching generally about sexual purity and the sanctity of marriage, that he would have thought this woman was wrong in her behaviour. And as a good Jew, he would have thought it was wrong also because, as the Pharisees point out, it's condemned in the law of Moses. Jesus has got a lot of reasons for thinking this woman's behaviour is bad, wrong. I think it's important that John introduces this story by saying they're teachers of the law, because Jesus' view of the law is quite clear. You read it in Matthew's Gospel, for example, in the Sermon on the Mountain, and Jesus said, I don't come to abolish this law, I came to fulfill it. Now, that's a tricky phrase in some ways, but it means he isn't abandoning the moral rules and values of the Old Testament, simply he's fulfilling them, adding a new dimension, in his case the dimension of the kingdom, the dimension of forgiveness, the dimension of grace, which is unpacked, of course, a little bit in the Gospels, but a lot through the writings of Paul and Peter and others in the rest of the New Testament, this ministry of grace, which doesn't in any way excuse sinful and bad behaviour, but it does put a layer on top of it which views it in a different light. So, where does that leave us in terms of thinking about today? Well, there's all sorts of discussions we could have about sexual sin or the nature of the law and so on. I just want to draw attention to one individual thing here. Maybe it's not the main point of this passage, but it's something that struck me as I read it again recently. The Pharisees cannot see beyond the single sin of adultery. They can't see this woman's wider life. They can't see her relationship with any children. They can't see relationship with a husband. They can't see any emotional trauma she's going through. They simply can't see her as anything other than an adulterer. That's all they're focused on, just this one thing. She's not a whole person at all. Her name isn't mentioned. Maybe that's quite deliberate. These Pharisees don't care. That's all they see. They're fixated on this one thing. Jesus, on the other hand, seems to view this woman with compassion and love as a whole person. I wonder what's going on in this woman's life that's brought her to this state. Jesus seems much more aware than anybody else is in this story of the wholeness of this human being, and he refuses to simply isolate adultery as the only thing that matters. And I've been thinking a lot recently, as many of you know who listen to these Start the Week vlogs, about the way Western governments generally are seeking to address the COVID dilemma. It's quite clear that the virus is a really horrible thing, particularly for older people and for people who are otherwise also unwell. For many younger people, it's asymptomatic or the symptoms are very mild. But for some, clearly, it's fatal. And it's a tragedy when that happens and people have their lives cut short by whatever illness, disease, cancer, heart conditions, violence, a road accident. These are all sadnesses that the human race faces. But one of the things I've been worrying about a lot is that people in authority in the Western world, not least in Britain, seem to see our country and the people in it through one lens alone, the lens of the virus. Let's get the virus under control. And at the same time forgetting there's a whole series of wider things going on here. Adultery is not the only question in this story, though it is in the minds of the Pharisees. In government official terms, we seem to be obsessed with the virus. All sorts of other things can be going on, and we may nod in their general direction, but the sheer damage caused by lockdown seems largely unaddressed. I can't understand why that's not being taken more seriously. If you're going to have lots of graphs about where the deaths may be heading to or the infection may be heading, and you decide that lockdown's the way to deal with that, either regionally, locally, or ultimately nationally, surely you should have another set of graphs that say, and if we do that, these are the consequences. We expect to have this many extra deaths from heart attacks, this many extra deaths from cancer, this many extra deaths and pain from suicide, mental health conditions, etc., on and on. Surely, in the interest of focusing on the whole human being and not just one issue, you'd have those questions. Surely, and you'd also be talking to us as adults, as the British people or Western people, so that the assumption is that we're mature enough to cope with all the information about the whole of human existence, not just stuff about COVID-19. Let's face it, we know, for example, that we're much better at treating this. Perhaps we should say that. We know that there's almost 1% of false positives when tests are made. So if we've got 250,000 tests a day, and perhaps we do, 2,000 of them are going to be false positive. Perhaps we could say that in the interest of a little bit of encouragement. Deaths are nowhere near where they were in the spring. We're obviously coping with this much better. Perhaps we could say that from government sources. And perhaps when we're talking about the whole person, I was reading this statistic this week, there have been 26,000 extra deaths at home this year than normal since March. And only 3% of those were from COVID. What caused the other 97%? And shouldn't we be made aware of that? Because every treatment has to be balanced against its side effects. In fact, if lockdown was a treatment which had to be approved by the relevant medical authorities, I'm not sure lockdown would ever get approval, because there's so many massive side effects. It's clear that the damage caused by it is worse than the virus itself, as we've said repeatedly. And so it's not just a matter of protecting the elderly, which people keep going on about in terms of the virus. We've got to be protecting the elderly. We've also got to think about protecting the young. Now you might say, yeah, but Steve, they're not in danger from the virus. Of course they're not. But they are in danger of no job to go to. They are in danger of massive pandemic of mental health issues. They are in danger of their life chances being ruined because of their education being interrupted. There have been 2 interesting letters to the national press this last week that I've found quite moving from older people. Let me read them to you. It's a reminder that it's not just about protecting older and elderly people. Here's someone in Wales. Dear Sir, I am now genuinely frightened. How can you not respect that? How can you not feel the pain of this letter? I'm genuinely frightened, not by the virus, even though I'm 80 years old. We have spent the last 8 months learning about the risk and how to keep safe. What's frightening is the ease with which the First Minister and the Welsh Government has closed down Wales. As we approach Remembrance Day, we recall those who gave their lives for us to be free. Now we face tyranny from our own government. That's quite a frightening thing to hear from an 80-year-old who's thinking not just about a virus, but about issues to do with freedom. And then here's another one. I am 83 years old with underlying medical problems, and my wife is not far behind. We have survived wars and many an economic crisis. We're used to managing risk. In common with most of our generation, we did not expect or want the younger generation to suffer as a result of the draconian lockdown measures being implemented. We, perhaps with a little help when needed, can protect ourselves at a fraction of the cost of the current measures. So what I liked about both these letters was the great reminder this is not just about a virus, not just about protecting the elderly, which seems to be our hysterical mono-focus, but here are 2 older people in their 80s who recognise that there is a pandemic, not of the virus, but affecting our children and young people. So, all of that to say that we really need to be praying hard and working together to remind governments and to remind one another that we are whole people, not just victims of a virus. That is one part of our lives, and it's a horrible part. But there are far more dimensions to human existence than that disease. Far more. And we've got to wake up to them. We've got to be honest with people, telling people what those complications are in order to have the right kind of financial policies and the right kind of interventions, which are much more measured across a range of concerns, not simply locking down because of a virus every time rates rise, which they will. That's the necessity of this thing. A lockdown simply kicks the can down the road and it bubbles up again some months later unless there is some sort of serious vaccine or a treatment which we haven't yet come across, and who knows when that will occur. So I encourage you today to think about human beings in the round, to think about all of our needs, because we have deep needs. If the virus was the only thing, we certainly should be locked up in our homes, none of us allowed out ever. That way, at least, the virus couldn't spread from person to person. So, we know that that can't happen, so we're going to have to find a way to live with this. And we're going to have to find a way as Christians and as churches to do what Jesus did, faced with this woman and her accusers who were obsessed with a single issue, adultery. And we've got to look at human beings in a holistic way. And we've got to be working hard to help care for people who are unemployed. We've got to care for people who are feeling mentally ill and stressed, who are dying of other conditions, who are fearful to approach the National Health Service. They're terrified they might catch COVID in hospital, which, by the way, given the percentages who catch it in hospital, that's not an unjustified fear. So there's all sorts of ways we should be working, praying, financially supporting, and energized as kingdom people, saying we've got spiritual needs, we've got physical needs, got emotional needs, got lots of needs, not just this one need. So today, pray you'll enjoy this story, pray you'll be blessed as you read it, and pray that your prayer life, pray that my prayer life will be stimulated to agonize on behalf of the poor and the young and the disadvantaged, for whom this mess is worse than ever, and sadly made worse by some of our interventions. So enjoy John 8 and continue, please, to be prayerful for our leaders who have got a terribly difficult job, criticised for whatever they say or do, and we must be people who pray for them in all that we do. So God bless you this week as you reflect on that. Pray that you'll be stimulated in your thoughts and prayers for Jesus' sake and for the sake of human flourishing all over the world.